The Billionaire's Second Chance. Luck Lake Short Reads Romance. Written by Bree Livingston. Narrated by Liz Crane. Chapter 1. Hadley Shaw grabbed the buzzing phone, slowly inching itself to the edge of her desk. Her posture softened as she read the caller ID. Pierce Westwood, one of her best friends since college. "Hey, Pierce, I'm leaving the office now. I promise I won't miss my flight." She turned, looking out the window. A few years ago, she'd opened her own real estate company, Hadley Shaw Realty, and her business space overlooked a park. She'd never had the opportunity to visit, but at least she could live vicariously through the people who did. Which made attending her best friend's wedding all the more appealing, since it was taking place in Luck Lake, a small town in the Black Hills of South Dakota. His wedding was the reason she'd spent the morning handing out tasks to her office staff, so she had time to run home and pack before catching her mid-afternoon flight.
"I hope not. This is not an area you want to drive through at night. You'll miss all the scenery."
He chuckled.
"Are you sure you don't want me to pick you up? I don't mind."
Part of her wanted to say yes, but the 2-hour drive to Luck Lake with limited cell reception was too enticing. She struggled to recall an extended amount of time where her phone wasn't ringing. "No, I'm actually looking forward to the drive from the airport."
"Okay, just wanted to make sure I wasn't failing in my host duties."
He laughed. She smiled. He'd always been a sweet guy. They'd even dated a little, but it didn't work out. The next thought knocked the breath out of her. Lincoln Novak. 5 years later, and her heart still stung when his name floated to mind. She'd planned to marry him, but life had taken them from Texas to opposite sides of the country. Him to Florida and her to California. Not long ago, she'd caught an article on him in Forbes when he'd been profiled for their top 30 billionaires. Her chest had swelled with pride for him. Her guy, and how successful he'd become, opening his own brokerage firm. "No, you're good." She pulled the phone from her ear and checked the time. "Okay, I'm walking out now," she said as she stood, sandwiching the phone between her ear and shoulder as she grabbed her purse and briefcase. "I'll see you later." They said their goodbyes, and she tossed the phone in her purse as she stepped onto the elevator. Once the doors shut, she sagged. She loved her career in real estate, but lately it seemed so monotonous and unfulfilling. Wake up, work, come home, and the cycle repeated itself endlessly. It had been one of the points of tension between her and Link. She'd found success as a real estate agent, and it had taken him a while to find his footing. But boy, had he found it. To tell the truth, she'd been a little surprised to see him in the magazine. He'd always been so carefree and wild and fun. He'd never cared about packing his daily schedule with things to do. But he also hadn't aged out of the foster system, which meant he had nothing to prove. Most would have said Hadley didn't either, but that was never how she saw it. The elevator jostled as it landed on the first floor, and the doors opened, letting the real world back in. It was a couple of weeks with an ex-boyfriend. She'd handled tougher situations than that and walked away unscathed. Link was the past, and she had a career she'd built from nothing. What if only caused grief. Dreams and fantasies had no place in the real world. Still, those two little words seemed to follow her no matter how successful she was. Putting the phone to his ear, Lincoln Novak waited for the line to pick up. In just a few short hours, he'd be landing in South Dakota to attend Pierce Westwood's wedding. They'd been best friends since college, and Pierce had asked him to be the best man. It had been a wild story. After purchasing a town called Luck Lake, Pierce had reconnected with his childhood crush, Bethany Holland, and they'd gotten engaged almost a year earlier on Thanksgiving. Once Link met her, he could understand the appeal. She was as sweet as she was beautiful. He'd liked her, and he was glad his friend was happy.
"Hey, Link, how's it going?"
asked Pierce.
"I'm good. 2 weeks left of bachelorhood. You ready?"
Link shoved away thoughts about their mutual friend, Hadley Shaw. When he'd pictured his future, she had been the missus to his mister. But she'd been so focused on her career that he'd let her go. Granted, it had been good for him. He'd never pictured himself as the corporate money type, but he'd found himself playing the stock market, and the next thing he knew, he'd opened a brokerage firm. It had been fun, but he forced the thought away. That was a rabbit hole he wanted to avoid. Pierce laughed.
"Yeah, I'm ready. I've been ready."
He paused and cleared his throat.
"Are you going to be okay with Hadley being there?" "Yeah, I'll be fine. The past is the past. I've missed her friendship."
The words gushed out of him before his heart could catch up to his brain.
"It'll be great seeing her,"
he said, putting all the confidence he could muster into the last sentence. Pierce took a long drag of air.
"Are you sure?"
"Of course." Link left off the not. In reality, he had no idea how he'd react when he saw Hadley. It was like combat training. As long as the bullets were rubber, bravery was easy. Once it was live fire, self-preservation took over. Whether he chose fight or flight would be a mystery until he was face to face with her. Although, flight was currently edging out the fight option.
"Awesome. It'll be great having you two here. It's been so long since we've hung out together."
Link nodded.
"Yes, it has." He smiled. "I'm looking forward to seeing both of you." "Okay. You're sure about driving here? I can pick you up, man."
"Nah, I've got it.
My phone is filled with music, and I'm ready for a little solitude."
Plus, it would give him a chance to get ready for the next 2 weeks with Hadley. She'd chosen the path she wanted, and he had to accept it.
"All right, I'll see you when you get here."
With an exchange of goodbyes, Link ended the call just as the pilot notified him that the plane would be landing in a few moments. 2 hours, 120 minutes. Yep, he could do this. He could hang out with Pierce and Hadley and act completely normal. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly, holding in a groan as he pictured himself crashing and burning. Where Hadley was concerned, his brain and his heart were out to get him. He didn't want to make a fool of himself, but he certainly wasn't betting on it. Chapter 2. Solid ground. Flying was great, but the amount of turbulence they'd flown through had Hadley grateful they made it in one piece. Now, if she could claim her luggage and get on the road, maybe she'd make it to Luck Lake in time to decompress before her vacation really started.
"Still rocking the Rainbow Bright? Or did you upgrade?"
That voice. Her heart skidded to a stop, stuttered, and then hit the speed of light. There went her 2-hour pep talk on how to handle seeing Link. Nervous energy pooled in her stomach and made her lightheaded. She may as well have been showing her first house. Taking a quick breath, she plastered on a smile and faced Link. Jeez. 5 years had only made her heart grow fonder, and the attraction was still just as strong. He'd always been gorgeous, with his wavy black hair combed back with his Superman curl, one that he hated and tried to kill, but she totally loved, with his equally dark eyes and olive skin. Her hand came to her face as memories surfaced of his 5 o'clock shadow brushing her skin as they kissed. she'd never seen him in anything but casual clothing. His dress shirt, slacks, and sports coat threw her. 5 years suddenly felt like a decade. What else could have changed about her reliable Link?
Hadley, are you okay?
Worry coated the words. She shook her head. Oh, yeah. Sorry, it's so good to see you. Just as she went to hug him, he stuck his hand out to shake hers. It was that awkward hug, shake, hug dance she'd seen when people greeted each other and didn't know what boundaries were in place yet. Link chuckled and pulled her into a hug.
It's good to see you, Hadley.
His voice lowered, sending an army of goosebumps down her body. Oh, and if he smelled any better, she'd swoon. It's good to see you too. Her heart and her body were both out to get her as she relaxed in his arms. She'd been a one-woman show for so long, and she'd forgotten how good it felt to have his essence covering her. Bad days were no match for Link Novak. Long before she ever wanted it to end, he released her and stepped back.
So, the luggage?
Hadley rolled her eyes. Yes, it's still rainbow bright. I know it's not professional, but I've yet to lose my luggage, or get it mixed up with anyone else's. Link held his hands up in defense.
I'm not knocking them. Just wanted to know what I'm looking for.
Right. She smiled. Sure you're not.
No way.
He chuckled, looking away and then back to her.
So, how have you been?
Lonely, overworked, and stressed. Great! Real estate is booming just as much as ever. The practiced answer felt forced, but it was the one she gave everyone when they asked. The thought made her pause. When had she started thinking that way? She'd worked hard for her success, and she didn't want to come across as ungrateful for it, even if it wasn't as satisfying as she wanted it to be. I saw the write-up in Forbes. She chewed her bottom lip, poking his stomach. Pretty great. The smile on his lips disappeared and returned so fast she almost missed it. Shrugging, he said,
Yeah, I guess. It was weird. They made me wear a tie. I nearly choked to death.
Not surprising. Link was the king of t-shirts and jeans, or in the summer, shorts. Her gaze dipped to his feet. Loafers?
My Birks don't go with the dress pants and shirt.
With the somber tone of his voice, she lifted her gaze back to his, to find a level of sadness in them that she'd never seen before. Worse, she didn't doubt the same was reflected in her own eyes. Somewhere between their split and the airport, she'd lost something. The nagging little voice in the back of her mind attributed the feeling to Link, but they'd made their choices. Second chances were fairy tales, and Hadley wasn't a princess. Link's hope to keep himself together died the second Hadley faced him. Every nerve he had was set ablaze. His mouth went dry, and the only thing he wanted was to take her in his arms and kiss her. The ensuing rejection guaranteed to follow such a reckless act was the only thing that had rooted his loafers to the airport tile. Man, she looked good. Great was a better word. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, but hung almost to the top of her shoulders. Her skin was creamy, and her jade-colored eyes were as easy to drown in now as they were when they were together.
So, did you rent a car, or is Pierce picking you up?
He asked, working to watch his words. She'd always been the girl to tangle his tongue and throw him off balance. If there was the slightest possibility of embarrassing himself, it was when he was around her. I rented a car. You know me.
Independent and in control?
Two things that summed her up. For some reason, she'd always been driven to take those two traits and grip them tighter than anyone he'd ever known. Shrugging, she nodded. Pretty much. He so wished. But I could be persuaded if someone wanted to ride shotgun. She smiled. Close proximity. 2 feet at most. If he had a tie on, he'd be pulling at it. If this situation were a cake, the salt would be mistaken for sugar. But Hadley... His heart sang with his head providing the backup singers.
Okay.
The words tumbled between his lips, and he forced himself not to wince. The no he'd planned got lost between his brain and his mouth. Now he'd signed up for a 2-hour car ride with a woman he'd never stopped loving. Sure, he could pack up his life and move to be with her. But that wasn't the issue that caused the breakup. She was dating her career when they were together. Now, she was married to it. The one thing his parents' marriage taught him was that it would never work out as long as she was giving everything to her work and nothing to their relationship. Great! It'll give us time to catch up. She chuckled. It's funny. I doubt we'll even leave the town, but I just needed the comfort of knowing I could leave if I wanted to. She laughed.
Me too. Plus, I would have needed a car to return to the airport since his honeymoon starts the next day.
Something he was supposed to have experienced with Hadley by now. Although he could apply that statement to everything in his life since their breakup. The gloom he was feeling had to stop. He was in South Dakota to help his friend get married and take a break. And that's what he'd focus on. Chapter 3. What had she been thinking, inviting Link to ride with her? He smelled good, looked good, and if she could, she'd pull the car over and kiss him until she couldn't breathe. She and her big mouth had gotten her into plenty of pickles as a college student. Truth or Dare was not a smart game for Hadley. And now it had her in a confined space with a man her heart ached for.
So,
Link's sentence tapered off as he scratched the back of his neck and shifted in the passenger seat. How do we make this not awkward? They'd dated long enough that they could finish each other's sentences. Even now, she could still read him. She gave him a glance and smiled. Nodding, he grimaced.
Yeah.
Well, we're both happy, right? Her head begged him to say yes, while her heart longed for no. Her vacation was supposed to be relaxing, not filled with turmoil over her ex.
Oh, yeah, totally. He nodded. I mean, living in Destin, Florida was my dream, and I have a house on the beach now.
Really? She spared a glance. If she wasn't mistaken, there was a slight blush to his cheeks. Not surprising. He was always modest about his accomplishments, which was a character trait she'd She cut the word off. They were the past. The best they could have now was friendship, and the only way to do that was to set her mind to it.
As close as I could get to the water. It's way bigger than I wanted, but I wanted privacy. It's in a gated community, which I would have never even considered until that Forbes article.
Hadley pushed on his shoulder with her hand. Oh yeah? The ladies were beating down your door, huh? The silence stretched a moment.
Actually, they are. I know it'll eventually stop, but all the attention makes me feel weird.
Have you dated anyone? She'd never asked a question unless she knew the answer, and not knowing the answer to this question had her gut twisted in a knot. Link took a deep breath.
No, I mean, I've had dinner with a few women, but it's never made it past the first date.
He cleared his throat.
How about you?
No, I've been too busy. After closing that first big deal on that house south of Houston, remember that one?
Yeah, I was proud of you. No one was able to sell it until you came along. You were so happy.
Sorrow seemed to cover the last sentence. Or maybe, like her, it was attached to the last few weeks of their relationship. Hadley swallowed back her regrets and continued. After that, it was a roller coaster ride. I started my own office about 1.5 years ago. I thought brokers had it easy, but lesson learned, they don't.
But you're the boss, and that's what you were working for, right?
Nodding, she took a deep breath. How many times in the last few months had she been asking that very question just to remind herself she had everything she'd ever wanted? Long days, longer nights, weekends, holidays, and every other day in between. She'd given everything she had to reach her dreams. Yeah, I've loved it. When had she started lying so much? And to herself? She was happy, fulfilled, and content. Only, it felt skin deep.
Good. I've always wanted you to be happy. I should have called.
Same. We just got busy.
Yeah. Busy.
The way he said it made her wonder if he was thinking of a different word. What could she say, though? Allowing herself to wonder or fret over it wouldn't change the reality of their situation. Sure, she was tired, but that didn't mean she wanted to give up her career. And all that was assuming Link would want her anyway. Their last fight had been an ultimatum between him and her career. A choice was a choice. It wasn't like she could change the past, and exhaustion was making things feel worse than they were. Another reason for this vacation was taking some time off and finding her love of her career again. Inwardly, she groaned. She was burnt out, and all this thinking was a product of that. What she needed was time off, and she'd find her game face once again. Chapter 4. Link was never more grateful to reach a destination than when they arrived in Luck Lake. He'd known being so close to Hadley would be bad for his mental health, but he wasn't prepared for the full-on gut-wrenching ache he felt. Hadley had confirmed how happy she was with her life. She'd built a career, a life, and he was just a memory. Though, for a second, he imagined a little regret in her voice. It was wishful thinking. She'd moved on, leaving no room for him. Stretching his arms over his head, he yawned and let his gaze roam over the tiny house he'd be calling home for the next 2 weeks. It was different, that was for sure. The light blue craftsman-style home with white shutters was eye-catching, while the small porch with 2 chairs and a table nestled in between gave it a homey feel. With a backdrop of mountains, trees everywhere, and the lake off in the distance, it was practically idyllic. Add a white picket fence and another 1,000 square feet, and Link would call it perfect. He took a deep breath, marveling at how clean the air felt. Pierce had sure picked a great place to call home. Not that Link would want to live there. He loved his oceanside residence. Sand, surf, and salt were where he belonged, but this was a perfect vacation spot. "These things are cool," Hadley said as she joined Link at the front of the car. She pointed at the house on the right. It was nearly identical to Link's except for the color and the dormer. "I think that one is mine." Right before they'd reached Luck Lake, Pierce had called and let them know he would be running late and that he'd put the keys under the welcome mat.
Yeah, when Pierce told me he was putting in a village of these things, it was hard to picture, but this was a smart idea.
Crossing her arms over her chest, she nodded. "I knew it was a great idea. They fit perfectly. I wouldn't doubt if a few people who find themselves here don't end up wanting to buy them. Although he may want to find a different spot for year-round living so his rentals don't dwindle." She sighed and turned to Link. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to go into work mode." He nearly laughed.
You mean it has an off switch?
She dropped her hands and lightly punched him in the arm. It's muscle memory. It's just how I think. This vacation was to help me find some balance. Before he could do something stupid like hug her again, Link stuffed his hands in his pockets and nodded.
Yeah, I told my assistant I was turning my phone off when I got here. I want some peace and relaxation.
Hadley's shoulders sagged. That sounds heavenly.
You mean you'll be taking calls?
He winced as it came out accusatory, which wasn't how he meant it. He sighed.
I didn't mean it that way. I'm just sure.
It was too late, though. Hadley's famous ice shield was activated. He could see it in her stance, and even more so in her eyes. I know.
Hadley, I didn't.
Yes, you did. You meant it just how you said it. You may have supported me in becoming a real estate agent, but you hated that my career took off. He knitted his eyebrows together.
You really believe that, don't you?
Well, didn't you? Isn't that what the ultimatum was about?
No. But you'll probably hear me now about as well as you heard me then.
He stepped back, walked to the trunk of the car, and grabbed their luggage, setting hers on the ground as he shouldered his duffel bag. For a second, he stared at her suitcase, debating. The gentlemanly thing to do would be to take her luggage to the door, at the least. But she didn't need anyone, especially Link. She could be just as happy without him, probably more so because then she wouldn't have someone nagging her all the time. The words from their last fight hit his heart like a hammer. He pulled his hand from the luggage and stopped as he reached her. His head was filled with all sorts of things he wanted to say. Most of them he'd regret because he was angry and hurt. Instead of saying something that might make him disappointed in himself later, he lowered his gaze to the ground. Have a nice vacation. I'll see you around. Without waiting for a response, he strode to the front door, stooped to get the key, and quickly went in. Once he was safely inside, he leaned back on the door as his bag dropped to the floor. She actually thought he hated her success. He told her over and over that it wasn't about the success. It was about her making it the only thing she was living for. All Link had wanted her to do was carve out space for him. It didn't even have to be Link-sized. He would have hunched over if it meant being with her. He didn't want her breaking their dates, which had dwindled to maybe twice a month at the time. Pushing off the door, he raked his hand through his hair. A small part of him had quietly hoped that... He squashed the sentence. Yeah, he'd hoped, and she'd snuffed it out. There was no them. There never would be. It was past time for him to accept that. Once his vacation was over, one way or another, he was moving on. For real this time. Chapter 5. A week later, Hadley was still fuming about the fight she'd had with Link when they first arrived at Luck Lake. Since then, she'd actively avoided him. Oh, he'd tried to talk to her, but she'd made it abundantly clear she wasn't in the mood to talk. He'd eventually taken the hint and left her alone. Aside from that, it had been a surprisingly relaxing week. Well, as much as she could between calls. There weren't fires per se, but they still needed the attention only she could give. Unlike ex-boyfriends who were now billionaires, she couldn't just ignore phone calls. This was a vacation, though, and her plans, despite anticipated calls, didn't include dwelling on an ex. Shaking her head to clear the thoughts, she tried to focus on the book she'd picked out from the book-filled shelves in the tiny house. They ran along the top of the wall, starting where the kitchen ended, and formed a U-shape in the front half of the house. At first, she'd wondered how anyone could reach the shelves, and then she'd figured out that the accent chair facing the couch held a stowed-away step stool. A cool little feature. She was still amazed at the efficient use of space. From the living room, which occupied the front half of the house, the kitchen could be seen. It had a neat little rack situated over the sink that held pots and pans so they could drain after being washed. The living room was to the right of the house, and it sported a couch lining the wall and a small chair facing it. She could see the kitchen on one side and a door leading to a bathroom on the other side, tucked under the stairs. While it was very impressive at a little over 300 square feet, it had only taken a couple of days to realize how much she loved the spaciousness of her apartment in California. A knock came from the door, and she pushed off the couch. With just a few steps, she reached the door and opened it. "Hey, Pierce!"
"Hey,"
he said, embracing her. He leaned back, smiling, and then dropped his arms to his sides.
"I'm sorry it took me so long to get over here."
The same day Hadley got to town, Pierce had called to say he was leaving town for the week with Bethany. Her seamstress had called about her dress, and there had been some misunderstanding with the measurements. Bethany had been panicked, and Hadley couldn't blame her. "It's okay. You made up for it with the stocked fridge." She laughed. "Is the dress okay?" He nodded.
"Yeah, it's all worked out. Did you have a good trip? Link said you rode here together."
"We did." She returned to the couch and sat. Pierce lowered himself into the accent chair.
"Wow, that's the first time you two were together since—"
"The breakup? Yeah, and I wish I hadn't—" Her sentence was interrupted by her phone ringing. "Let me get this real quick." She grabbed her phone sitting next to her and answered it. "Hi, Hadley Shaw of Shaw Realty speaking."
"Hi, Hadley. This is Mary Smith. So sorry for calling, but I wondered if you had the number for the house warranty. Our water heater died on us this morning just before Rich and I took showers."
Hadley puffed a piece of hair from her face. Rich and Mary Smith were nice people as long as Hadley did whatever they wanted. She'd sold them a home over a year ago, and they were still calling her about anything that went wrong. How many times now had Mary called for the warranty number? Didn't they keep paperwork like that? Hadley knew she would. "Hi, I'm not in the office today. You'll need to call my assistant, Melinda. She'll have the number for you." While she'd received calls from the office the entire week, this was the first call from a client. She'd emailed her list of clients every week for a month, letting them know she'd be on vacation and that her assistant would be happy to take calls.
"Oh, well, since you sold us the house, I thought you'd be the one to call. Besides, that Melinda gal is rather flighty. I don't trust her as much as I trust you."
Mary's tone always had an edge to it, and when Hadley didn't jump like she was supposed to, it was worse. Hadley palmed her forehead, quietly took a deep breath, and let it out slowly through her nose. "Right. I'll get the number and text you. Is that okay? That way you'll have it, in case you need it again." The woman huffed.
"I guess that'd be okay."
"Thank you. I really appreciate it."
"You'd think with the money you made from us purchasing this house, you'd at least be willing to help us without complaining about it every time."
Biting her tongue, Hadley forced out, "I apologize. I will get the number to you as soon as I can."
"Good. Talk to you soon."
The line went dead as the last word was spoken. Hadley groaned as her hand dropped to the couch, letting the phone dump onto the cushion next to her. "I'm so sorry. Some of my clients are seriously high maintenance." Pierce chewed his lip and looked at the floor.
"We need to talk."
The last time she heard those 4 words, Pierce was breaking up with her. Granted, if she'd spoken a second sooner, they would have been her 4 words, too. "About what?" He lifted his gaze to hers.
I thought you and Link would have worked things out by now. I know he still loves you, and you still love him."
Rolling her eyes, she crossed her arms over her chest. Don't start. We made our choices. He has his life and I have mine. He's the one who couldn't handle our relationship, not me. He gave me an ultimatum. Remember? Pierce held her gaze a moment, almost like he was debating how to reply.
Right.
He sighed and stood.
Anyway, I wanted to check on you and invite you to dinner at Bella's tonight.
Link would be there, but she could ignore him long enough to hang out with Pierce and Bethany. Sure, sounds great. She pushed off the couch and followed Pierce to the door. He grinned, but it wasn't his typical full-face one.
I'll see you tonight.
He opened the door and paused.
Hadley, I'm proud of your success. I hope it's giving you the happiness you deserve.
Thanks, Pierce. It meant the world to her to hear him say it. I appreciate it. With a wink, he closed the door as he left. Why couldn't Link be supportive like that? She was happy. Sort of. Burnt out a little, but a few weeks of rest and relaxation would get her rested up and back in the game. All she had to do in the meantime was to avoid her ex as much as she could. Even as she thought it, her heart ached. It had been a long 5 years, and in a matter of a couple hours, they'd started fighting. Maybe they could call a truce and just not talk about that aspect of their lives? That way they could move on. Be friends. It was at least worth trying. Chapter 6. Link scratched his head as he yawned and got up to answer the door.
Hey, Pierce.
He shook his hand and opened the door wider so his friend could enter. Pierce grinned.
Did I wake you up? Nah. Well, yeah, but I was awake earlier. I think I dozed off.
He laughed.
I'm sorry I had to bail on you guys so quickly.
Shrugging, Link waved him off.
We're good. Is the dress okay?
Nodding, his friend smiled.
Crisis averted. I'd have been back sooner, but Bethany wanted to do a little shopping, and I couldn't say no.
He inhaled and grimaced.
Was the drive here okay? Great, until it wasn't.
Link raked his hand through his hair as he walked to the couch and sat.
I think it's time I let her go.
He'd said the words before, but there was always a little hope. Always. It was Hadley, the love of his life.
It kills me to say it, but I can't wait for her anymore.
He'd been doing nothing but thinking about it the past week. After figuring out she was avoiding him, he'd done his best to abide by her unspoken wishes. Usually it didn't last long, but by the 4th day, he'd given up trying to talk to her. Pierce took a seat on the couch, sitting forward with his elbows on his knees.
I don't think so either. So many kids in the foster system fail, and she's worked her entire life to prove herself. I'm not sure she knows how to quit. Yeah.
Link wished Pierce was wrong, but he wasn't. Hadley had received awards and accolades, and they would never be enough until she decided they were.
I just can't anymore. I'm holding a candle for someone who doesn't want to be held. I know. I'm so sorry, Link.
He leaned back.
Are you gonna be okay? I will be. What can I do to help?
Pierce asked. Shrugging, Link shook his head.
Nothing, but I appreciate the sentiment. You sure? Yeah, I'm sure.
That was about the only thing Link could be sure of. Nothing could fix his grieving heart, but time.
All right, well, I wanted to invite you to dinner tonight at Bella's. I wasn't thinking when I did it, but I invited Hadley too.
Shrugging, Link heaved a heavy sigh.
It's okay. I can handle it. Besides, she's the one avoiding me. Okay, well, I have a few errands to run,
Pierce said, and stood.
If you do need something, let me know. I'll make it happen.
Link pushed off the couch and walked Pierce out.
Thanks. See you at Bella's.
His friend jogged down the 2 porch steps, got into his Bronco, and drove away. Just as Link turned to go back inside, a woman in a t-shirt and jeans stepped out the front door of the house next to Hadley's. She walked to the open trunk of her car, where she began to fight with a piece of luggage. He stepped off the porch and crossed the distance between their houses.
Do you need any help?
The woman stopped and straightened, running her fingers through her blonde hair, pushing it back from her face. Yes, please, she said, dropping her arms to her sides as she groaned in frustration. Man, she was cute. Not Hadley cute, but he had said he needed to move on. He crossed the rest of the distance, and in one swift move, he pulled her luggage out of the trunk and set it on the ground.
I can take you to the door if you'd like.
That would be awesome. She stuck out her hand. I'm Madison Colvin. He shook her hand.
Link Novak. Nice to meet you.
As she shut the trunk door, she asked, Are you here for the wedding or just a vacation?
Wedding. Pierce's side of the aisle.
He laughed.
Are you a friend of his?
Bethany. We went to high school together.
Longtime friend, then. That's cool.
An awkward moment of silence passed, and Link scratched the back of his neck.
Are you going to Bella's tonight?
Madison nodded. Yeah, Bethany raves about the place. I can't wait to try their bread. She said it's worth the hip-widening calories. She chuckled. He laughed with her.
Pierce did mention that. Did you—
hello? Link startled and turned.
Hey, Hadley.
Hadley's gaze flicked from Link to Madison and back a few times before landing on Link. Hi.
Oh, Hadley Shaw, meet Madison Colvin. She's one of Bethany's friends. Madison, this is Hadley. Pierce, Hadley, and I attended the same college.
That's cool. No college degree here, but I can bake a killer chocolate cake. Hadley pulled her gaze from Link and smiled. I dabble with baking, but it's mostly out of a box. She looked back at Link. I thought we could hang out a bit and catch up.
Why? You're angry with me. So much that you've avoided me for a week.
The words came out as stony as his look. She waved him off and stepped closer. No, just, I got caught up in something, she said, and laughed nervously. Could I speak to you a second? Link held her gaze. What on earth was Hadley doing? He had no idea what this thing she was doing was, but it was weird.
Well, I would, but I'm going to help Madison get her luggage inside the house, and then I'm going to get ready for dinner at Bella's. He looked at Madison. Madison said she'll be there too.
Nodding, Madison added, Yep, Bethany called while I was driving here. But Hadley laughed, and it held a weird edge to it. We've got so much to catch up on, Seeming to pick up on the uncomfortable vibe between Link and Hadley, Madison grabbed the handle of her luggage. It's okay. Go ahead. I bet you've got a lot to catch up on. I can manage it from here. She waved as she walked toward the house, pulling her suitcase with her. Setting one hand on his hip, he faced Hadley head-on.
What was that?
Shrugging, Hadley clasped her hands in front of her and fidgeted with her fingers. Nothing. I just wanted to make up for the past week without letting a total stranger know about it.
Hadley,
he said, and then shook his head.
A
high-pitched ringing came from her jeans pocket, and she held up a finger. 1 second, that's all I need. He stared at her. There had never been a clearer sign that her work would always come before him.
Take it. I don't have any left to give.
He turned and squeezed his eyes closed, moving away, starting with one foot in front of the other until he reached his door. Glancing over his shoulder, he found her seemingly torn between following him and answering the phone. The period at the end of their relationship. Shaking his head, he stepped inside. The ache of walking away from her had taken every ounce of effort he had, but it was the only way he knew how to put distance between them and get over her. Chapter 7. Hadley parked her rental car at Bella's and gulped as she watched Link emerge from Madison's car. For some reason, even after he walked away, she just assumed Link would be riding with her to dinner. It was just a given. She wasn't even sure how she arrived at the restaurant without wrecking the car. She'd been on autopilot. 1 second she was answering the phone in the living room with her makeup half applied, and the next she was a car length behind Madison and Link, following them to the restaurant. It had all started with catching them talking. Hadley had glanced out her window, and a wave of jealousy had consumed her. That was her Link that Madison woman was smiling at, flirting with. Hadley didn't have proof, but she could have sworn her nails grew 4 inches, perfect for clawing that man-stealer's eyes out. Only Link wasn't her man, and Madison wasn't stealing him. Hadley had practically thrown him into her arms. Perhaps that was why half of Hadley's makeup was currently streaking down her cheeks in a torrent of tears. Link wasn't hers. The way he'd turned away from her, saying he'd given her all he was going to, had cleaved her heart in 2. It had shaken her enough that she'd never answered her phone, and she'd never returned the call, mostly because she'd been weeping uncontrollably. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened, and she set her forehead against it. What was she going to do? She was the one who'd pushed him away by choosing her career over him. A career that she'd always wanted. How many times had she overheard people talking about foster kids never making anything of themselves? She'd vowed to never let those words stifle her. Hadley Shaw might have been a foster kid, but she was a master of her destiny. She'd studied hard, maintained excellent grades, and graduated valedictorian of her high school. Those grades had given her the ability to pay for her entire 4-year college degree. A tap on her window made her jump, and she looked up and smiled. As she rolled down her window, Pierce asked,
"What are you doing?"
He looked a little harder at her.
"Are you okay?"
"Yes." A sob broke from her throat. "No." Again, she dissolved into a mess of tears. Pierce opened the car door and squatted next to her.
"Hadley, what happened?"
"Link talked to that Madison woman." The words were clear in her head, but the way they tumbled out of her mouth, there wasn't a translator made that could decipher it.
"What?"
Pierce asked. Hadley sniffed and fought to make herself clear. "Link talked to Madison." His eyebrows rose.
"Okay, but why are you crying?"
Her hands slid to her lap, and her mouth dropped open. "Why?" "He's talking to another woman, carrying her luggage and smiling and laughing. My Link. He's my Link." Nodding, Pierce pulled his lips in, looking at the ground and then back to her.
"What did you expect, Hadley? Did you think he'd just wait forever for you?"
"What sort of question was that?" "Of course not."
"But you're upset that he's talking to another woman. That's part of him moving on. He's going to find someone else."
He stood.
"I've tried staying out of this, but you need to figure out what you want and then do it. It's either Link or people who don't even care enough to let you have a day off. Personally, I think he should have moved on long ago because he's a good guy and deserves better."
He huffed.
"I'll see you inside."
Hadley gawked after Pierce as he walked away. He'd never been that harsh before. Grabbing her purse from the passenger seat, she dug inside until she found her pack of makeup remover wipes. As she cleaned her face in the vanity mirror, the look on Link's face before he walked away played in her mind again. She'd actually seen it before. More than once. All the times she'd rushed home way later than she said she'd be, at the end of some of the arguments they'd had. And most recently, after their fight when they arrived at Luck Lake. The lies she'd told herself this whole time was that he hated her success. In reality, it was the only way she could justify picking her career over him, time and time again. Something had broken inside of her when she'd spied him talking to Madison. An overwhelming surge of jealousy and anger and possessiveness had hit her in such a way that it startled her. It was him or her career, though. He'd made that clear. Actually, what he'd made clear was that her career couldn't come before him. If she were honest, in her heart, she wouldn't want any less than that for herself, and it had been incredibly self-absorbed to demand Link to accept that. After she finished cleaning her face, she took a minute to look at herself in the mirror, not only making sure the makeup was all wiped away, but studying herself. What did she want? Her life in California was amazing. Not only was her career something to be proud of, but her apartment was in one of the most sought-out areas to live. She had everything she'd ever wanted, except Link. That moment, the thought of him being with someone else had nearly crushed her under the agony of just imagining it. How would she feel when it was real? Hadley rubbed the spot over her heart and fought to control another wave of tears. She'd been so determined to show people she wasn't just another kid in the foster system that she'd neglected the one person she loved. With all her heart, soul, and mind, she wanted Link. She'd give everything she owned, all her awards, everything to be with him. Then another thought hit her. What if she was too late? A vision of her life without Link unsettled her to her core. She got out of the car and shut the door, practically running to the restaurant. Whatever it took, she was going to show him that he meant the world to her. That he was all she wanted. Chapter 8. I'm telling you, this will work. Madison leaned over and whispered to Link, "Trust me. If it doesn't, then you'll know for sure." What started as asking for a mere ride to the restaurant had turned into a confessional. He hadn't meant to say anything, but then Madison had asked about the strange exchange between him and Hadley. From there, it had all just spilled out. From meeting her, to dating her, to the breakup, and finally the strange way she'd behaved when he was helping Madison. Link shook his head.
Her career means everything to her. She'll probably love that I'm moving on. Knowing her, she'd want to meet the new girlfriend even. But I still don't want to hurt her on purpose with a charade.
Madison pulled back with her eyebrows near her hairline. Oh, I hope to meet a man like you one day. You really are sweet. Shaking his head, he smiled.
I'm single.
She blinked. First, I'm not a cheater. And yes, I know you're not officially taken, but you are taken. Second, a man who loves a woman like you love Hadley doesn't just get over her. I'm not a rebound hound. A bark of laughter popped out of him.
That's one I've never heard.
He inhaled deeply, crossing his arms over his chest.
Seriously, though, she's chosen her career over me time and time again. I'm just done. She's in a relationship with her career, and there's no room for me.
Just then, Bethany stopped next to Madison and leaned down, hugging her.
I'm so glad you came.
Of course I was coming. There's no way I'd miss your wedding. Madison covered Bethany's hand with hers. I do need to talk later, though, okay? You bet. Out of nowhere, Madison giggled loudly and smiled wide. She just walked in the door, and if looks could kill, I'd be dead, she said through her teeth. Link, don't look and be aloof. Bethany leaned down again. What trouble are you stirring? Madison rolled her eyes and turned sideways in her chair, whispering, His ex is so jealous. It's a wonder she isn't turning as green as a bullfrog. Bethany's gaze flicked up and back to Madison. Ah. Pierce's soon-to-be wife looked at Link. Yeah, she is not a happy camper. I'm going to do my host duties and say hello. Before Link could peek over at Bethany and Hadley, Madison placed her hand on his arm. Just trust me, okay? He locked eyes with her and nodded. Okay, but I think you're wrong. Then he quickly added, I don't have to act like I'm done. I'm moving on, and I mean it this time. It was less for Madison and more for himself. Madison's gaze flicked from Link to Hadley and back. All right, but I'm not wrong. I guess we'll see. And just like that, hope built in his chest. He wanted so much for Madison to be right. If she wasn't, at least he'd know for sure, and he could walk away once and for all. Hadley was a woman on a mission. She was going to pull Link aside and tell him she was done. Her career, her choices, everything, they were nothing without him. A few hours ago, she would have thought someone was on something to even suggest she'd give up everything she'd ever worked for. It was like a switch had flipped in her. Seeing Link with someone else had made her nauseous. Hey, Hadley! Bethany stopped her and smiled. I'm so glad you could make it. We were just about to order dinner. It's a good thing I live here, because if I didn't, I'd be tempted to eat enough to outgrow my dress. You're going to love this place. Bethany was easy to like, and under normal circumstances, Hadley could spend hours talking to her. To find they had so much in common was a pleasant surprise. Anyone who loved salmon mousse as much as Hadley did was a rare find. Yeah, I bet I am. Hadley peeked around Bethany, watching as Madison laughed again. It was loud, annoying, and obnoxious, and it had to stop. I really need to talk to Link. Well, the live music is about to start. Not sure you'll get much talking done, but there's a seat across from him. No one's taken it yet. Maybe during breaks you could talk? She smiled. It wasn't ideal, but maybe Hadley could suggest they talk during one of those breaks. They had a history. They loved each other. Link would want to talk to her, right? That sounds great. How about after dinner, you, me, and Maddie sneak away for a girl talk at my house? It's just as tiny as yours, but I have a neat little patio Pierce had built for me this past summer. Bethany glanced over her shoulder and looked at Pierce. When she brought her gaze back to Hadley, there was no mistaking she loved her soon-to-be husband. Link had looked at Hadley like that before, many times, and she'd never appreciated it. If she was given another chance, she'd cherish expressions like that, like she should have all along. That was if... Otherwise, she'd need all the girl talk she could get because her heart was going to be shredded, and she'd be the only one to blame. Nodding, Hadley placed her hand on Bethany's arm. That sounds exactly like something I need. She wasn't sure about Madison, but Bethany's friend was innocent and not deserving of Hadley's venom. Awesome. I'll let Maddie know. They walked together toward the long table set up for family and friends, going opposite directions when they reached it. Hadley sat, keeping her attention trained on Link. Apparently, he turned into a stand-up comic with the amount of laughing coming from Maddie. "Link," Hadley said, leaning forward, "could we—" As if the universe had turned against her, the band started playing before she could get the sentence out. Moments later, Pierce took Bethany's hand and began dancing with her. Any other time, Hadley would have thought it was the most romantic thing ever, but the urgency she felt to talk to Link overshadowed everything. Maddie turned to Link. "Oh, I love this song," she gushed. "Would you dance with me?" "He doesn't dance," Hadley blurted out louder than she planned. Link looked at Hadley, held her gaze for a moment, and returned his attention to Maddie.
"I'd love to."
He took her hand, pulled her to her feet, and off they went. Dancing. Link. Dancing. It was a good thing she hadn't eaten because it would be all over the floor. Her throat began to close up as her heart buzzed in her ear like a hummingbird. Beads of cold sweat broke out on her forehead. Was this what a heart attack felt like? What was she going to do now? How could she get him back? A crushing thought overwhelmed her. Maybe she was too late. Chapter 9. Curled in her bed, Hadley had stopped trying to wipe her tears away. Halfway through dinner, she'd excused herself and quietly slipped away so she could return home. She was sure Bethany wondered what happened, but Hadley just didn't have words. She'd tried to talk to Link the entire evening, only to have him either ignore her or give curt, one-word answers. Something he'd never done to her, no matter how angry he was. If seeing him with Madison hadn't been a wake-up call, then that would have been for sure. He'd always get mad, and later they would make up. The last fight before the breakup was a little different, but even that hadn't felt like this. They may not have spoken for the last 5 years, but that didn't mean she didn't care about him, or think of him. If she'd called, she had no idea he would have at least spoken to her. Her phone rang next to her on the bed, and she lifted it just far enough to read the caller ID. She answered it and put it on speaker. "Hey, Pierce."
"Bethany has been looking for you. Where are you?"
"I'm at the house. My little house." She sniffed and grabbed a nearby tissue, blowing her nose. "Link wouldn't speak to me, and I couldn't take watching him with Madison." A sob bubbled up in her throat, and she failed to hold it in. "I've lost him."
"So you're just giving up? Just like that? No fight? No nothing?"
"Pierce, what do you want me to do? He wouldn't even speak to me."
"I want you to be Hadley Shaw, the woman who doesn't stop fighting for what she wants. Do you love Link?"
She sniffed. "Yes, more than—" More than what? That was the entire issue. "I love him more than anything, including whatever career or life I've built in California."
"Then prove it. Hadley, you are a brilliant woman. You've sold homes other agents couldn't sell because you didn't wait for offers to come to you. You went and found them. Now go and figure out a way to do the same for Link. Show him you've heard him. Make him listen."
Akin to a spring, Hadley bolted upright in the bed. "I am strong and brilliant."
"Exactly,"
Pierce laughed.
"It's why you're one of my best friends."
"I can do this." She checked the time on her phone. It was only 6 in California. There was plenty of time to come up with something to show Link that she hadn't just heard him, but that she wanted him. Wanted to be with him. Whatever she had to do. "I have to go."
"Don't get caught in something and forget the rehearsal tomorrow."
"Not on your life. I have a man to woo." Pierce snorted, and they said their goodbyes. She knew exactly what she was going to do, and she knew who could make it happen. By tomorrow, Link would know just how serious she was about him and their future. Chapter 10. Rubbing his face, Link worked to wake himself up as he sat in the front pew of the brand-new small chapel. He'd been up all night thinking about Hadley. She'd arrived at the dinner with no makeup on, a look he'd always loved, and he'd noticed her puffy eyes. Normally, he would have tried to find out what was wrong and console her, but he was tired of being runner-up to her career. His decision to give her the cold shoulder, on top of Madison's ridiculous plan, had upset her, and he knew it when she left before she finished her meal. He'd almost rushed out after her, but he'd forced himself not to. For once, Hadley was going to have to be the one doing the chasing.
"Is everyone here?"
the minister asked, looking from Pierce to Bethany. Bethany looked around. One of my bridesmaids is missing. Just give her a few more minutes." Link rolled his eyes. Of course Hadley would be running late. She was probably on the phone with someone and lost track of time.
"I bet she's dealing with a client or something."
"And you'd be wrong, Link Novak," Hadley said as she walked from a room situated to the left. He gaped at her.
"I didn't even know you were here." "Me either," Pierce added. "When did you get here?"
"I've been here since about 8 a.m. I wanted to make sure I wasn't late." She squared her shoulders and lifted her chin a little. Then she settled her gaze on Link. "You and I need to talk."
"This isn't the time, Hadley."
He could feel everyone staring at him.
"We can talk later?"
Her chin lifted a little higher. "No, we can't." She looked at Madison and back to Link. "I am in love with you. I have been since our second date to that carnival when you spent the entire ride back home throwing up after eating a bad turkey leg, and you're going to listen to me." He stood and walked to her.
"Hadley,"
he whispered.
"Not now."
Bethany laughed.
"Oh no, please continue."
Hadley smiled wide. "Thank you. It's taken too long for me to realize that nothing is more important than you. Nothing. My career, my life in California, the friends I've made. None of it matters as much as you." Her phone rang, and she pulled it out of her pocket.
Link worked his jaw. "You know what? Take the call. I'm done talking."
He went to walk away, and Hadley grabbed him by the arm. She held up the phone, putting it on speaker. "Hi, Janessa. What do you think of the proposal?" In the middle of a church full of people, during their friend's rehearsal, here Hadley was, working on a real estate deal. He pinched his lips together and then opened his mouth to speak. Hadley lifted on her toes and clamped her hand over his mouth. "Listen!" She held his gaze. "Yes, Janessa?"
"I think Hadley Shaw Realty would be a fantastic addition to Harris, Piedmont, and Frey Real Estate Firm. My assistant will get a meeting set up with your assistant, and we'll hammer out the details then. We'll talk soon."
Link had to be hallucinating. He took Hadley's hand from his mouth and said,
"What?"
"Yes, ma'am." Hadley beamed as she ended the call.
"What was that?"
"It was me showing you that I would rather be with you. There is nothing on this earth that I want more than you. I don't care what mountain I have to move, how far I have to walk, or how many bodies I need to crawl over. Whatever it takes, I'm going to show you, prove to you, that you are all I want. I'm just sad I wasted 5 years without you."
"But your business, Hadley, that's not what I wanted."
"I know. You wanted me to let you be a part of my journey, and I wouldn't let you because I thought I had to do it alone. It was stupid and selfish and—" Link took her face in his hands and touched his lips to hers.
I have always, always, always loved you.
Tears pooled in her eyes. I'm not too late? Taking his hands from her face, he wrapped his arms around her.
I think I would have gone to my grave waiting for you. Once you stepped into my life, there was never anyone else I wanted to be with.
With that, he touched his lips to hers again, and the world melted away. She was in his arms, giving all of herself to him, and it was better than he'd ever imagined. Before the kiss could get too carried away, he broke it and set his forehead against hers as people slowly began to applaud.
It's about time, Pierce laughed. Link grinned. Yeah, it is.
Nodding, Hadley said, Way past time. I love you, Link.
I love you.
It had taken 5 years and countless prayers, but she'd been totally worth it. Whoever brought her back to him, he was going to be eternally grateful. Epilogue. 3 days later. Hadley snuggled closer to Link as they sat outside on a blanket, gazing up at the stars in a cloudless sky. The wedding was beautiful, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. I don't think Pierce would have cared where or how as long as it happened.
He chuckled. Since their scene at the rehearsal, Hadley and Link had spent nearly every moment together, making up for lost time and the kisses they'd missed out on. He told her she didn't need to sell her company, but ultimately, she decided to do it anyway. She was proud of what she'd built, but it wasn't satisfying. She'd left California tired, overworked, and burnt out. It had become a chore to get up in the morning and go to work. She'd had a dream, fought to make it a reality, and then come to the conclusion that the only reason she'd done it was to validate her existence. She was a foster kid. No one had wanted her. That had been the force behind all of it, and it had left her empty. Hadley rubbed her thumb across Link's palm, more content than she'd been since they broke up. I don't think Bethany would have either. They looked so happy.
They did.
The words came out softly, and he kissed her nose.
There's something I want to do,
he said, untangling himself from her and pushing off the ground, bringing her with him.
Come on.
What are you doing? He took her by the hand and positioned her on the top step of the porch before flipping on the light.
Stay right there.
Okay. She drew the word out. They'd had a little wine, but not enough to affect his behavior.
I would have done this sooner. But first, I didn't want to take any of the focus off Pierce and Bethany, and second...
He paused, digging in his pocket and pulling out a velvet box. As he went to one knee, Hadley's jaw dropped and she inhaled sharply.
I had to pick this up from the post office earlier today. I've had it for about 6 years. I picked it because it was the one you loved, but we were a little poorer then.
Link, she whispered. If it was the ring she was thinking of, it had been so pricey at the time, and now it would be considered a trinket. But she'd loved it then, and funny enough, she'd often wondered what it would have been like to have it on her finger. He looked up at her and smiled, opening the box.
We have spent entirely too much time apart. I love you. I have never stopped loving you, and I will never stop loving you. Please.
Yes! Laughing, he rolled his eyes.
Marry me?
Yes, absolutely. Taking her finger, he slipped the ring on as he straightened. Before he could say another word, she flung her arms around him and kissed him. I love you. His lips touched hers, sending a fire through her body that the chilly air couldn't put out. They'd shared many kisses the past 3 days, but this kiss had to be the sweetest. He was hers. This was what she'd wanted all along. To love and be loved by Link. This has been The Billionaire's Second Chance, Luck Lake Short Reads Romance. Written by Bree Livingston, narrated by Liz Crane. Copyright 2020 by Elizabeth Jane McKay. Production copyright by Elizabeth Jane McKay.